I was born on a farm in northern Alberta, and my mother was a great gardener, and so was my grandmother. And so my gardening interests really stemmed from my family. I'm Gil Stelter of Guelph, Ontario. Guelph is a little city located about 60 miles west of Toronto in Ontario. Why did I ever get involved in this crazy world of daylilies? It started by accident. I am a professor of history at the University of Guelph, and I regularly went back to Edmonton and Fort Saskatchewan, where my parents lived, where my mother gardened. And one spring, about 13, 14 years ago, I noticed that there was a little clump of flowers lying sideways in our backyard, and the clump was blooming. And if you know what northern Alberta weather is like, you know that this plant has just come through a really nasty winter. Well, Mother said that she had too much of this little plant called a daylily. She had dug some of it out, she'd thrown it in the backyard and forgotten about it, and there it was lying after being outside all winter, blooming. So I decided, well, that thing really has a great will to live. I'll take it back home and I'll plant it. So I brought it back to Guelph, and the thing was blooming, and so I went to the university library to look up daylilies and to find out something about this strange little thing, because I didn't even know what a daylily was. And I ran into a book by a guy by the name of A.B. Stout, among other books that were in the university library. And Stout really started me on the whole thing, and I read his book, published in 1934, with great interest, and then I decided, well, I'd better find out what the current situation is with daylilies. And so I looked in a gardening journal we had, and there was an ad by Maureen Strong, and she was selling daylilies in the Niagara area of Ontario. So Sally and I drove down to see Maureen. I bought a couple of daylilies, planted them, and that was the beginning of this addiction. I had, by this point, an idea in my head as to what I wanted to do with daylilies. Bear in mind, I was reading Stout and the whole historical approach to daylilies. And so I'd been to Japan and seen their gardens, and I was fascinated by the Japanese approach to gardening. And they have what they call the Japanese stroll garden, in which a path meanders through the garden, and as you walk along, you can't ever see the whole garden at one fell swoop. You see constantly changing vistas as you go along. And so I thought, why not have a winding path go through the trees, because there were mature trees on this property, just trees and grass of on 3/4 of an acre. Why not plant the daylilies chronologically, starting with the species, and then the earliest hybrids, and then go slowly through the decades, picking what you regard as the very most important daylilies of any one particular decade, and then ending up back at the house through the trees at the present situation. What I guess I didn't count on is that I would live so long, and that the years would pass and I would soon run out of space. And so now we're into the front yard as we keep adding new daylilies as new introductions come out by other people. I think my first cross was inspired by Stout, and by this point I had Citrina, the great dip nocturnal, and I started to cross that with dips. I knew enough that doing anything else would be difficult, and so I quickly had a bunch of seedlings, and it was one reason why we moved gardens, actually. Because we quickly ran out of space. Those dips produced so much seed, and we had some very, very interesting stuff. But as dips are wont to do, we got big flowers on the top, and the whole thing fell down when it rained or when it was windy. And so I talked to some other people, and they said, well, you should get more into tets. And so I started crossing a few tets, but then once I got into crossing tets to the fulva, the triploids, then that opened up another whole area for me. But in general, my first major movement was dip, which I slowly have moved away from. And then secondly was to take hardy northern tets to the tender Florida tets. And then thirdly, and I continue to do that, and then thirdly to move into the experimental stuff with tets and fulvas. And when I first started telling people about doing this, you have to remember that if my PhD had been in botany rather than history, I never would have tried this, because the textbooks all say that you can't cross tets with trips or tets with dips. Well, of course you can if you're patient. And so I started, because of the interest I had in what Stout was doing in collecting species, I had developed a fairly good collection of fulva varieties. And I began with one that Stout had named Hankow, fulva Hankow, but never seems to have used in his hybridizing. Well, I discovered that about 1 in 5 or maybe 1 in 3 crosses with tet pollen onto the fulva as the pod parent, I would get a pod, and so on. Well, when I started talking about this with the established hybridizers in Canada, and then particularly in the US, their answer generally was, well, why in the world would you want to do this? We're trying to get away from fulva, from the ditch lily. Why are you doing this, first of all? Well, I wanted the vigor and the hardiness of the fulva, because here in the north, that's a major concern. So they would generally say, well, after why, then they would say, well, it can't be done. And I said, well, I'm getting pods. And they said, they won't mature to ripen seeds. Well, when they ripened and the seeds are okay, they said, well, they won't germinate. And then I said, then when they germinated, they said, they'll never bloom. And then when they bloomed, they said, these will be sterile, and so on. And so I didn't get a lot of encouragement in this particular aspect of my work, but I kept trying, and after all, I knew in the background that Stout had crossed diploid species with the triploid fulva species, because the Fulvia Europa, which is a very hard one to use, that's the ditch lily, is behind 1/3 to 1/2 of all of Stout's introductions. So don't tell me that you can't cross dips with trips. You can, and so why not try it with tets, which is what I did. And now I have thousands of seedlings, 3 introductions, and many more to come, I hope. This whole business sounds as though I'm doing this by myself, but this is a partnership between Sally and myself. And it would be impossible for me to manage the size of garden and to do the hybridizing work that we do without Sally's hard work. So I get to do the fun parts, the actual hybridizing, the naming, the record keeping, and so on, and she does and manages a lot of the hard work of mulching and weeding and moving stuff. So this is my advice is get a good partner who is younger and stronger than you are, and can make this kind of thing a success. Usually we plant, in the past we've planted between 1,200 and 1,500 seedlings, but in the last 2 years I've cut it down to 1,000, and I'm going to cut it down even more this fall. So I'm really more careful as to what I'm actually doing. I'm doing some very difficult crosses with a new big tall fulva from China, which I got from my friend Artur Jasinski in Warsaw, and I'm putting crosses on it, but I'm cutting back on the more conventional regular stuff that I've been doing because I have a lot of seedlings that are semi-selected that we need to cut down on. So I'm at this stage where, and it's a matter of space, we simply have to cut back. My biggest challenge in hybridizing, I guess, is the continuing the successive generations of the Tet fulva crosses. And what I've discovered is that in the second and third generations, the vigor, the kind of vigorous explosion that Brian Mayhew found with dips and species is happening in my garden. And so I'm getting these humongous plants, and this is when fulva is approximately 1/4 to 1/8 of the total genetic makeup of the plant. The plant itself is tremendously vigorous, and the flower generally its shape and form and color is determined by the Tet thing. So my biggest challenge is to see where I can go with this Tet fulva combination. If I've had a mentor, it would have been Stout through his books and through his writings, and I've collected all of the articles he's ever published, so I have and read every letter he ever wrote, and he kept perfect records of all of this stuff. So I have a pretty good idea of what he thought about and how he did things. So he was an early mentor. Stanley Saxton helped me when I was through letters when I first was beginning, and then the whole daylily world through the daylily robin and so on has been a real help in thinking things through and working out my methodology, even though a number of major hybridizers thought I was nuts when I first started doing this Tet fulva stuff. Who is the greatest hybridizer in the past? Well, I guess I'd have to go with a man that I've written several articles on in the Daylily Journal, Arlo Stout. I was going to do a book on him and decided eventually that because I'm not a plant scientist, I couldn't analyze some of the stuff that he was doing and so on. But Stout, in a way, has been my long-term mentor in his philosophy of things, the kinds of his interest in the species, his concern for the quality of the garden value of a plant, and so on. So I think that Stout has been tremendously influential. He created the first UF, the first dark red daylily, the first tall daylily, and so on. I greatly admire some of the things he did. He unfortunately lacked a sense of humor, whether that's typical of plant scientists in general or not, I don't know, but he's kind of a boring guy who did interesting stuff, and so I still admire him very much. When you see the name Griffin in front of any of our introductions, it simply means that plant has fulva in its genetics. And so the griffin, I should say, is a mythical animal. We've seen statues and pictures of griffins in archives and in museums in Syria going back 2000 BC. So griffins are big in our garden. We have 3 statues and we'll get more. It also happens to be the name of the athletic teams at the University of Guelph, where I spent most of my career. If I have any regrets about my involvement in the daylily world, it's that I didn't get started sooner. So many of the successful hybridizers have done this for a long time, long before they retired from other occupations. But I really only got going seriously in hybridizing after retirement from the university. And so I can only do a limited amount in the short time I have. But it should make people realize that after retirement, there's a whole new career and a new life possible, and that you can actually do quite a lot, even as a backyard hybridizer, in a few years, just because daylilies are capable of being handled and manipulated and changed in a fairly short period of time.